And joining us now on the debate in Washington, D.C., Bob Killebrew. He is retired U.S. Colonel and Senior Fellow at the Center for a New American Security. And Alex Thier, Director for Afghanistan and Pakistan at the U.S. Institute of Peace. In our nation's capital, Roland Paris, University Research Chair in International Security and Governance at the University of Ottawa. And here in studio, Mercedes Stephenson, military analyst, also host and producer of her own show on iChannel, and Globe and Mail journalist Graham Smith, who covered the war in southern Afghanistan from 2006 until recently, now working on a book on this subject. And we welcome all of our guests in the American capital, the Canadian capital, and the Ontario capital to our program today. This topic, of course, very top of mind for many Canadians. We lost 5 more soldiers over the Christmas holidays. And so we want to understand where we're at in Afghanistan and look forward to see whether recent policy decisions will make a difference. We'll start by looking back. Over a month ago, after several weeks of deliberations, this is how U.S. President Barack Obama announced his big decision to the world. Roll tape, please.
As Commander-in-Chief, I have determined that it is in our vital national interest to send an additional 30,000 U.S. troops to Afghanistan. After 18 months, our troops will begin to come home. These are the resources that we need to seize the initiative while building the Afghan capacity that can allow for a responsible transition of our forces out of Afghanistan. I do not make this decision lightly. I opposed the war in Iraq precisely because I believe that we must exercise restraint in the use of military force and always consider the long-term consequences of our actions.
Mercedes, just give us a little perspective here. The number of troops that Obama is using as this surge, how does it compare to what's already there?
Well, he's putting in an additional 30,000 troops, as we heard, and there's approximately 100,000 already in the country, as Graham and I were discussing earlier. If you look at, in particular, reference to Canada, we're in Kandahar province. When we started there in 2006, it was just the Canadians. There was 1,000 Canadians. There are now 4 times that number in terms of Americans and Canadians, about plus 5,000 on Task Force Kandahar, and we're expecting an additional 8,000 to 10,000 Americans to come into Kandahar alone this summer, plus the Marines who are pouring into Helmand province. So it gives you an idea that you're seeing a significant increase in numbers. And previous to Obama's announcement of this surge, there had already been a request for more troops that was being responded to by the U.S. government as well.
That 100,000 you referred to, is that American troops only, or that's everything?
That's ISAF troops. So you're looking across the entire country.
Gotcha. Colonel Bob, we know that the president's military commanders were asking for this surge, similar, I guess, to the one that was asked for in Iraq some years ago. Why did they feel this surge was necessary?
Because the number of troops they had in the country was not sufficient for the kind of strategy that General McChrystal believed had to be fought. Up until this time, remember, Afghanistan was a limited force theater for us. All of our focus, the United States focus anyway, was on Iraq. As Iraq has started to calm down and it looks like maybe some kind of a qualified success story, McChrystal went in, changed the strategy in Afghanistan, but didn't have enough troops to execute what he thought was necessary.
Did he get everything he wanted here?
He didn't get quite everything he wanted. The details of what he's going to get will be worked out in the future, but what he got was mostly, I think, mostly adequate to do the kind of strategy he wants to do.
We'll pursue more on that strategy a little bit later. Roland Paris, to you now. A couple of years ago, you wrote an article advising NATO, go big or go home. And does the Obama plan, in your view, do that?
Well, the circumstances have changed since 3 years ago when I wrote that article. And the window for a really massive international military presence in Afghanistan is rapidly closing. I mean, it is coming up on a decade. And this mission, like I should say, many other missions, including in much more welcoming environments, faces a similar kind of problem, which is that no matter how benevolent the interveners might present themselves as, gradually, over time, the welcome disappears from locals. So the window for action now is quite limited. Whether this 30,000 is enough to turn the tide, which is the way that Barack Obama described the purpose of this extra deployment, remains to be seen, but something would have to happen very fast, I think, in order to justify the continuation of such a huge presence.
Alex Thier, does this Obama plan go big enough for your view?
Well, I think that to build on the point that Roland was just making, the critical thing and the critical difference with the history of the Soviet experience in Afghanistan is that the Afghans, by and large, continue to welcome a robust international presence in military, civilian spheres. The problem, however, is not that they don't want what we're offering in terms of the promises that we've made to improve security, to improve governance and justice, to deliver more services. The problem is that we fundamentally failed to deliver on those things. And so to answer your question, I think that the question of the troops is that they may be sufficient to do the job. I think the bigger challenge that we're facing right now is on the civilian governance side, is whether our partners are there in the Afghan government to be able to make this strategy work, and whether the international community itself is going to be sufficiently robust and coordinated enough on the civilian side to make this strategy succeed.
Graham, you want to follow up on that? Do the Americans have a partner in Hamid Karzai who can make this thing happen?
No, of course they don't. And I have to say, I was just astonished to learn from Alex Thier that, in fact, the Afghans are welcoming our presence there in southern Afghanistan. I mean, I don't know about you, Alex. I have no idea what you're basing that on. I'm sorry to say. I spent 3 years down there in Kandahar, and I know that you're relying on polling that has been done from some institutions that are based in Kabul, but I have to say, all indications in the Pushtun Belt, in the south and east of Afghanistan, is that we have no idea where the genuine political center lies. That, in fact, our presence as international forces are probably not entirely welcome there. And
let's get Alex to respond. Where in fact, are you basing this, that they want a robust force there from outside?
Well, again, I mean, I was in Afghanistan as recently as a few weeks ago. I was not in Kandahar on this trip, but I think that all the polling indicates clearly that there is still a widespread support for international forces remaining in the country and a rejection of the Taliban. I certainly think that we're not facing a generalized popular insurgency in the way that the Soviets were. That's, of course, not to say that there is support for everything that the international community does, and there's great disappointment with how we've conducted ourselves with issues like civilian casualties. But that's quite a different thing than to say that the Afghan population, in large part, let alone the majority, rejects the international presence. I don't know. I think that there's good evidence to suggest that it does. There's maybe some anecdotal evidence that Graham has to suggest that there are certainly people who reject it, but I've not seen anything that suggests comprehensively there's evidence that there's broad rejection of the international presence in the country.
Okay, in which case
there are clearly complaints about it.
Okay, let me get Graham on this then. Your discussions with people on the ground down there, they're not making an equivalency between what's happening today and what the Soviets were doing 30 years ago, are they?
No, in fact, in many cases they say the Soviets were better organized, that the Soviets appeared to at least have a plan. There was some kind of, top-down organizational structure, whereas, my friends have often described what's going on in southern Afghanistan as trying to hold an Olympics where every member of every Olympic team is trying to be part of the organizing committee. That just, it's a mess. And what's happening right now is the 30,000 extra troops are going to stave off failure for a little while longer. But it's a Band-Aid, and at some point we're going to have to come to some kind of reckoning about what's actually going on there.
Let me follow up with Colonel Killebrew on that then. What should have been in the plan, in your view, Colonel Killebrew, that was not in the plan that President Obama announced?
Well, there are three factors here that I think the discussants have all touched on. One was there was a question as to our president's determination to stick this out. This is obviously a NATO exercise, but also obviously if President Obama had come up limp in his talk and seemed indecisive, that would have knocked the pins out of this strategy. The second piece, which needs to be emphasized over and over again, is that the people in Afghanistan don't want the Taliban. They might not like us in certain circumstances, and I've certainly heard the complaints also, but they don't want the Taliban back. That wasn't the case when the Mujahideen were fighting the Soviets. That's the big difference. And the third piece that we've got to keep coming back to is the core of the new strategy is that the Afghan National Army and the Afghans themselves have to take over this war. The 30,000 troops are not going to be there forever. We're not going to maintain this peak of forces forever. And the Afghans now, I am told on pretty good authority, have that message. And the ANA is going to be expanded. The police force is going through some other kind of rejuvenation. We've reorganized the NATO force commands so that we're not trying to play 1,000 different tunes at once as we did in the past. And I think by this time next summer, we're going to see some changes in the war. This looks to us now.
Okay, Mercedes, if you looked at the plan, what would you like to have seen in it that perhaps President Obama doesn't have there today?
Well, I would have liked to see the extra 10,000 troops. I'd like to see the
So
civilian.
McChrystal asked for 40 and
he'd
you
asked
wish
for
it was 40.
And he got 30, and I'm not really sure what the point was of doing 30 instead of 40. If you're going to go to 30, you really might as well go and give the 40. It wasn't like he went halfway.
You know the answer to the question, though.
Well, compromise.
Compromise?
Political compromise,
Satisfying the
but is this
domestic
about
politics?
political compromise, or is it about making Afghanistan a priority? And if you're going to be decisive about making Afghanistan a priority, then 10,000 troops at that point, you're adding another quarter. It would have made sense. So that, yes, but of course, troops are never the answer on their own. You have to have the strategy. McChrystal's strategy, as the Colonel was pointing out, is McChrystal's. It's not Obama's, and it's a fantastic strategy. It's smart. He went there and he really looked at what was going on, and some of my friends who are in Afghanistan now in the military tell me that they're conducting operations very differently, even in terms of how they're driving. It used to be that the rule was you didn't stop no matter what. Went as fast as possible down the road to avoid being hit by IEDs, by suicide bombers. They're now actually obeying the traffic laws in Kandahar City. That exposes you to a lot more in terms of a threat level, but it's allowing them to be more compatible with the population. And so it's looking at, obviously, the change strategy. Troops alone are never it. So seeing that, and also seeing, as we heard earlier, a real civilian surge. And that's something I think a lot of the European countries might be able to provide. They may not be willing to provide the troops, but what about looking at things like developing the judiciary and the bureaucracy, which are areas that they've got expertise in?
Roland, I want to get your take on this. Walter Russell Mead wrote in the January-February edition of Foreign Policy magazine, trying to get inside the head of Barack Obama, which a lot of people have done as they try to understand, why was it 30 instead of 40,000, et cetera. Here's what he wrote. Neither a cold-blooded realist nor a bleeding heart idealist, Barack Obama has a split personality when it comes to foreign policy. So do most U.S. presidents, of course, and the ideas that inspire this one have a long history at the core of the American political tradition. In the past, such ideas have served the country well, but the conflicting impulses influencing how this young leader thinks about the world threatened to tear his presidency apart, and in the worst scenario, turn him into a new Jimmy Carter. Obama's long deliberation over the war in Afghanistan is a case study in presidential schizophrenia. After 94 days of internal discussion and debate, he ended up splitting the difference, rushing in more troops as his generals wanted, while calling for their departure to begin in July 2011 as his liberal base demanded. It was a sober compromise that suggests a man struggling to reconcile his worldview with the weight of inherited problems. What do you think of that take, Roland?
I think that it's much too harsh. First of all, he sent 30,000, he agreed to send 30,000 American troops, but in fact there were 7,000 Allied troops also going, so they're going to get 37. I don't think the difference between 37 and 40 or 37 and 42 or 45 is really that significant. You come back to what the strategy is, as others have mentioned. I wouldn't characterize this strategy as fantastic. I mean, it's a terrible strategy, but the fact is that all the other strategies are worse. It's the best possible strategy under the circumstances, and I think that that's probably a fair way to characterize Obama's decision. It would be very unwise for him to pour tens of thousands, many more than he has, into Afghanistan in an open-ended commitment, given not least the experience of the Soviets, which we're going to get to in this discussion. So yes, his message ultimately included tensions and contradictions within it, but I think that those were largely unavoidable. And as I said before, they're going to have to demonstrate at least that the momentum of the insurgency has been stopped in fairly short order, I think, to be able to justify a very large international presence over the longer term.
Graham Smith?
What we're missing here, though, is big new ideas. You can't just change the way you drive on the streets of Kandahar and hope that the Kandaharis will all of a sudden embrace you. Now, there have been some major changes that we haven't mentioned here. You know, the number of civilian casualties is down dramatically in terms of the NATO-inflicted casualties. It used to be about a 50-50 split. We used to kill about as many as the Taliban killed by accident. And now it's about a 80-20 split. So that's a dramatic improvement.
That was a key priority for McChrystal.
And that's huge. That's really important. The other thing we've stopped doing is burning poppy fields. We're not going in there and raising people's major cash crop anymore in southern Afghanistan. And that's another major improvement. And so those two things, you know, they might help fix the situation. But to be honest with you, I think at this point, they're tweaks. And the situation is deteriorating so badly and so quickly that I don't know if those tweaks are going to be enough.
But do you believe, as Roland does, that what we have here are a series of terrible options and this is the least terrible of all those terrible options?
But at some point, when you're faced with a terrible situation, you have to act decisively. You can't just find some sort of consensus, because at this point, really, by adding 30,000 extra troops, what you have doomed southern Afghanistan to is years of escalating warfare. Tens of thousands of people are going to die because we're indecisive, because we can't figure out what to do next.
Colonel Bob Killebrew, you want to have a word on that?
Yeah, I have steam coming out of my ears now. There are four pieces, at least four pieces that we need to keep in mind here. Piece number one is the additional combat troops going in to try to stabilize the situation in southern Afghanistan. We've already talked about that. That's very important. Piece number two is rebuilding the Afghan security forces, both the police and the army. We've done a crummy job of that in the past. We are now putting the resources into it, and they are the long pole in the tent that has to be built in order for us to leave a peaceful Afghanistan eventually. The third piece is the ongoing special operations war against the Taliban's leadership, about which nothing much is written, but remember McChrystal ran that in Iraq, and it was very, very successful. There's a clandestine war going on all the time, decapitating the Taliban leadership both in Pakistan and Afghanistan, which implies, by the way, informer networks on the ground as well as the predators, that is devastating the Taliban. And the last piece, which we cannot overlook, is the actions of the Pakistani government and their attempts, faltering now but hopefully will getting better, to take out the Taliban strongholds in the Pakistani tribal territories. Those four pieces all come together. What we never had, and this is the big idea, what we never had was all four of those pieces acting together in a coordinated way, protecting the population, knocking off the Taliban's leadership, and building up the ANA adds up to a pretty sophisticated and I think ultimately successful strategy.
Alex Thier, would you share that analysis?
Well, again, I think that the big missing piece here, which in many ways is ultimately more important in the long term, is the question of civilian governance and how the Afghan government is perceived by the population. You know, the reason that we're in this situation now in 2010 is not because the Taliban were so strong. It's because the Afghan government was so weak and essentially was seen as predatory by a lot of the population. And they drove the population away from the government, and again, not necessarily into the arms of the Taliban in the sense that they support the Taliban, but certainly losing support for the government. And so if we're serious about these changes being implemented on the long term, we can't just be thinking about training the National Army, training the National Police, because if you do that without a broader rule of law system, without a broader sense of civilian control of the security forces, we know where that leads. And so what we really need to be worried about now is how Afghan governance looks at the national and at the sub-national level. And that's one of the reasons why this election process was so worrying. Not just because votes were stolen, you're not expecting a perfect election in Afghanistan, but it's worrying because it's indicative of how deep the rot is within the national government. And so unless a lot of action is taken this year to work on these things and to change people's perceptions of the civilian government, then I fear that even success in the areas that Colonel Killebrew outlined won't ultimately mean long-term success.
Okay, I don't want to look at we've looked at the last 8 years now. I want to go back even further now. And for many of our younger viewers, this is all going to be, you know, they may be learning about this for the first time right now. 30 years ago, the Soviet Union, as it then was, invaded Afghanistan, allegedly at the invitation of the newly installed communist government there, and that didn't end so well for the Soviets. I want to read an excerpt here from journalist Victor Sebestyen from the New York Times, and then we'll come back and talk about this. Over the years, the Soviets changed their tactics frequently, but much of the time they were trying and failing to pacify the country's problematic south and east. often conducting armed sweeps along the border with Pakistan, through which many of the guerrillas moved, as the Taliban do now. That war was characterized by disputes between soldiers and politicians. As Russian documents show, the politicians ordered the invasion against the advice of the armed forces. The Soviet leaders realized they had blundered soon after the invasion. Originally, the mission was simply to support the communist government, the result of a coup Moscow had initially tried to prevent and then had no choice but to back, and then get out within a few months. But the Mujahideen's jihad against the godless communists had enormous popular support within the country and from outside. Money and sophisticated weapons poured in from America and Saudi Arabia through Pakistan. The Soviets saw withdrawal as potentially fatal to their prestige in the Cold War, so they became mired deeper and deeper in their failed occupation. For years, the Soviets heavily bombarded towns and villages, killing thousands of civilians and making themselves even more loathed by Afghans. Whatever tactics the Soviets adopted, the result was the same: renewed aggression from their opponents. The Mujahideen, for example, laid down thousands of anti-tank mines to attack Russian troop convoys, much as the Taliban are now using homemade bombs to strike at American soldiers on patrol, as well as Afghan civilians. Colonel Killebrew, I know where you were coming from on the comparison between then and now, so I'm going to ask you to hold off for a second. Roland Paris, to you first. What's instructive about what happened 30 years ago in terms of our understanding how things are going today?
Well, first of all, I think that the characterization, that passage you just read, was generally true, but there was actually changes throughout the period of Soviet occupation, and they tried different strategies, and I don't think it's accurate to say that it was just entirely at every moment the same degree of failure. Because in fact, what the Soviets did was start off with a mission that had a very limited objective of regime change. Then they moved into a very expansive idea of Sovietizing Afghanistan. And they relied on very heavily on the kinetic or military operations. And then that was the period in the early and mid-1980s that the writer was describing, with indiscriminate bombings of civilian targets. And all they managed to do by using that kind of military force was to alienate the population and to serve to recruit new insurgents, even though they were winning all their battles on the battlefield. But what happened in the mid-1980s was that the Soviets adjusted their strategy, and there are some interesting parallels to the adjustments in the Soviet strategy at that time and what's going on now today in Afghanistan. They pulled back into the cities. They focused on protecting the cities. They gave up their idea of Sovietizing the Afghan population, the Afghan society, and they started to strike deals with local leaders and give more local autonomy. And that latter period of the Soviet occupation actually wasn't as unsuccessful as many people say. Ultimately, the Soviet Union fell, the Soviet Union withdrew. But there are some, although the comparison can't be taken too directly, there are some interesting parallels and perhaps lessons in what the Soviets went through.
Follow up, if you would, Mercedes. Then versus now, what's instructive about then that we can apply to now?
Well, I think you always want to learn from other people's mistakes whenever you can, but I also think that when people say, well, this is just the Soviets' experience in Afghanistan, part two, it's far too simplistic. When the Soviets were there, as Roland said, the degree of civilian casualties that were not only accidentally inflicted, but very deliberately inflicted, is a policy that NATO never pursued. We did not go through villages with helicopter gunships gunning down civilians because they were not being compliant. We do not face a generalized insurgency where members of the population want us out of Afghanistan. If you talk to Afghans in general, they don't say, we believe you're here to dominate us and we want you out. If they did, we'd be losing a lot faster than we are now, and you'd know quite quickly, because when Afghans want you out, it becomes very apparent. So I think that it's important to learn from that. And what Roland said about the lack of civil-military relations, which hopefully we're learning from now, and developing those strategies. Yes, we have pulled back into the populated centers. For example, we're focusing now a great deal between Kandahar city and about the center of Helmand. There's about 2 million people living in that area. But protecting the population doesn't just mean living in the cities, it also means defending that approaches. And why is that important? Because what we were talking about earlier with governance. Part of the Taliban's success has been the ability to set up shadow governments. And if you can't move into the areas and provide the population not only with the security they need, but the security to then develop actual Afghan-centric forms of governance, not Western, not Soviet, not any external imposition, then you're going to fail. Exactly.
Graham, mistakes made 30 years ago that are being made again today, do you see any?
Yeah, of course. But I think actually what Roland was onto is quite instructive as well about some of the successes that the communist regime had. I've said this before in your program actually, is that we need to learn from the dying days of the communist era, because in the dying days of the communist regime, the Soviet troops had already pulled out. They were getting massive cash subsidies from Moscow. And that regime stood for a couple of years when no one expected it to. And it only fell when the cash subsidies ended. And I think that's something we can learn from, because that era was marked by massive compromise. They gave up swaths of territory to the Mujahideen. They bought off the Mujahideen. They pitted Mujahideen figures one against the other, which I think is perhaps a more realistic exercise than the wishful thinking I think that we're going through right now, where we hope that the Afghans like us. It's like we're divining the inner thoughts of people in the tribal belt in southern eastern Afghanistan. We're hoping that they want our presence there and behaving accordingly, and that's insanity.
Okay. Having said that, Colonel Killebrew, I appreciate your position that you don't want us to learn the wrong lessons from 30 years ago and apply them towards today. But are there mistakes that did take place 30 years ago that we are repeating today?
That's a tough question. I think when we first went into Afghanistan, we started repeating the same mistakes, one of which was to assume that Afghanistan could be converted to a country with a strong central government rather than what has always been a weak government with associations of tribes and alliances. I think we've recovered from that. I think the time when we learned from the Soviets, with the possible exception of that last comment, are pretty well over. I think my experience, my impression from reading the Soviet experience was that toward the end they had gotten a lot of the counterinsurgency lessons approximately right, and what caused them to ultimately withdraw was not so much failures they were having in Afghanistan, although they were still failing, but failures back in the Soviet Union itself and the constant draw of Soviet money. I think that one of the things, and this is a purely personal opinion, that we should have learned from the British, that we could have learned from the Soviets, was that cash subsidies and decentralized approaches to tribes sometimes pay off a lot faster than trying to institute a central government in Kabul.
And let me just do a quick follow-up with you. You said that we've recovered from the idea that we can impose a strong central government in this country. When you say recovered, you basically mean we were wrong, we admit it, and we now know that the tribal landlords have basically got to run, warlords, have got to run things in the more rural areas. Is that it?
I think when we went in, it was more nuanced than that. And when we went in, our first concern was just to get a government up and functioning in Kabul. I think for the first several years, and I'd love to hear from the other guests on this, for the first several years, we thought the central government would be the primary agency by which we address the insurgency. I think we're getting more sophisticated now. I'm beginning to hear now in Afghanistan that we are restarting some of the tribal militias and taking advantage of some of the Mujahideen experience out there as opposed to the Taliban. And I think eventually we're going to come to a far more nuanced, far more leveraged approach to how the Afghan government and the Afghan government's allies in the country run the country.
Alex, you want to pick up on that? You just got back from Afghanistan after all.
Well, one of the things that I wanted to come back to in the critical failures that we're not correcting is actually about the peace process. Afghanistan has been at war now for 30 years, and it's been through several different iterations of war and a number of regime changes. And I think that one lesson in particular from the way that the United States funded the Mujahideen groups through Pakistan, and then the failure of UN negotiations for a handover in the late 80s and early 90s, we're facing some of those same challenges today. How do we work with regional players as well as our own interests to figure out how to bring the Afghan polity together, how to bring these different groups together to forge a peace process that would have a lasting impact? Unfortunately, we're not there, and in many ways we have the same dynamic with an insurgency that's hosted in Pakistan, that's supported directly and indirectly by the Pakistani establishment. And unless we get serious about thinking about the equities of different groups in Afghan society and what their future role is, then we're likely to continue experiencing conflict. And so one of the failings, I think, from the end of the Soviet experience and post-Soviet experience in the early 90s is something that we're facing again today. We need to think about how to include a broader array of groups in this discussion about Afghanistan's peaceful future. And if we fail to do that...
Sorry, I heard somebody say, can I jump in? Who's that?
That was me. I didn't mean to interrupt Alex. I thought he was done, but I just wanted to add to what he was saying because I think there's an important additional point, which is there is this need to think more carefully about how to bring these different interests within Afghanistan together. But there's a parallel need to bring the regional actors together. We heard a lot from Barack Obama during the presidential election campaign about the need for regional diplomacy around Afghanistan, not just Pakistan, but also India and Iran and the other stands and Russia and even China for that matter. He appointed a special representative, Richard Holbrooke, and he talked a lot about regional diplomacy. I would just add to Alex's excellent point about the need to bring together these interests within Afghanistan. The same needs to be done on a regional basis. Maybe it's happening behind the scenes, but I don't see a lot of evidence of it publicly.
Okay, we've got about 3.5 minutes left here, and I'd like to hear from all of you on this last point. Victory, I think, usually happens when one side has had enough. And I haven't heard too many observers of this war say that the side that the coalition is fighting is ever going to say uncle. In which case, Mercedes, to you first. What does success look like here at the end of the day?
Success looks like an Afghan, not just central state, but also local governments that can provide a reasonable amount of security to the Afghan people to pursue prosperity, their own security, their personal security, freedom of movement, and to deny terrorist groups the ability to operate, which is why we initially went into Afghanistan in the first place.
Graham, what does success look like?
We need to stop the bleeding. We need to get the escalation of violence to end. At the very least, it would be nice if it would just level off for a while. It would be nice if we could bring the level of violence down. It would be nice if we could reverse some of the terrible trends that we've seen over the last 6 or 7 years, where the central government has less and less control of the countryside every day. That aid workers have less and less ability to get in to help the people every day.
Okay, I'm going to cut you because I want to make sure I hear from everybody here. I don't want to run out of time. Alex, what does success look like?
I think to pick up on this earlier discussion, I think that it's an Afghanistan ultimately where the people are reasonably safe, reasonably secure, and have access to a decent livelihood, because I think that those things, if they're not achieved, will undermine all of our other objectives and ultimately the stability of the region.
Roland Paris?
I guess I have more minimal views about what success is in the context of extremely expensive, extremely dangerous commitment of troops and funds to this mission. In my view, success in the end is a situation where the territory of Afghanistan and Pakistan can't be used as reliably as a base for groups to mount attacks outside the region, including on Western targets, and secondly, where there is a limited risk of Pakistan's nuclear weapons coming under the influence of actors that we would find to be dangerous, having any control over those weapons.
Last minute to Bob Killebrew. What does success look like in your view?
I subscribe to everything that's been said, particularly Mercedes' formulation and particularly the comment about nuclear weapons. I just add 2 last things. Success in Afghanistan, that is the resolution of this conflict into some kind of tolerable level of pain, also rests with Pakistan's exercise of sovereignty over its tribal areas. Until those areas are satisfied or stabilized, we probably won't have peace in Afghanistan. And my last point is that history shows that religious outbursts like this, these virulent ideologies, normally only last for about a generation. So it's not a given for me that we're facing centuries of conflict with radical jihadists based in Pakistan and Afghanistan.
But in 10 seconds, can you see victory the way we classically define victory in military affairs happening here?
I can see victory the way Mercedes defined victory. A reasonably solid central government, local governance out in the provinces, the conflict reduced to what was the normal banditry that went on in Afghanistan for centuries, and eventually this virulent stream of Wahhabi jihadism dying off to a low rumble. And I think all those things are achievable.
I thank all of you for your participation this evening. Much appreciated. Colonel Bob Killebrew, the Center for New American Security, Alex Thier, the United States Institute of Peace, Roland Paris at the University of Ottawa in the two national capitals, Mercedes Stevenson from iChannel, Graham Smith of the Globe and Mail here in the Ontario provincial capital. Thanks so much, everybody.